Hi, you're right. Welcome to the final part of A Tell-Tale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. So, distraction free. Do you have a pen? Do you have some paper? Then we will begin. We'll begin, as we always do, a little retrieval quiz. So if you could pause the video now and answer those 4 questions. Good luck. Okay, well done. Let's go for the answers. Number 1. What P means devotion to and vigorous support for one's country? The answer, of course, is patriotism. What did William Blake want to help reform in society? The child labour laws, thinking of those little poor chimney sweeps and other horrible jobs that small children had to do, and also in broader terms to reform the restrictions the church and monarchy placed upon society. Number 3, what is one thing Wilfred Owen felt war did to soldiers? Dehumanised them, prematurely aged them, or killed them. So that idea of forever change. Okay. Simon Armitage's poem Out of the Blue is about what tragic event? Sadly, it's about the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which was the attack on the Twin Towers. Okay, so after I've done, we're going to be looking at kind of themes and ideas that are expressed in this short story in a bit more detail, explorations in evil and eccentricity. But of course, this week we've been reflecting on this particular story by Edgar Allan Poe. A reminder, guys, that madness, one definition, is a state of wild or chaotic activity, which might be a good way to describe our narrator, particularly in the way that this story ends today. But first of all, a verb that comes up a couple of times in this poem, I think it's a great verb, so I think it's worth really reflecting on a little bit, is the verb vex. You may or may not have heard of this before. So it's a verb. What I'd like to do is like to pause the video, write down the verb, the definition, the example, and the synonyms, please. Good luck. Alright, so to vex someone or to be vexed is to make someone feel annoyed, frustrated, or worried, especially with trivial matters. Synonyms include aggravate, aggrieve, annoy, or anger. An example would be, he continued to vex me with his incessant tapping. And the icon reflects that sense of building frustration. So, I'm going to read you just part 3 today. But if you wanted a rather jazzy reading of it, then click on that link there and it'll take you to an audio recording of it itself, okay? So we're going to do that. Pause the video now, go to that link and listen to the whole story. There'll be a comprehension quiz afterwards. I have all 3 parts here, guys. Okay, part 1, part 2, and part 3. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to read part 3 to you because I've already read parts 1 and part 2. Part 3. If you remember, building up to this, of course, part 2 ended with the beating of the old man's heart increasing his fury as the single ray was being shot towards his vulture eye, as it was described. Okay, so now this is how the story continues. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say, louder every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous. So I am. And now, at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet, for some minutes longer, I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst, and now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbour. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leapt into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. Then I smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily but in silence. First of all I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. Then I took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scantlings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary for that. A tub had caught all, ha! When I had made an end of these labours, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men, who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbour during the night, suspicion of foul play had been aroused, information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what had I to fear? I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room, and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But, ere long, I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears. But still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more distinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definiteness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I now grew very pale, but I talked more fluently with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men. But the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting, and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all, and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, no, they heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. And I thought, and this I think, but anything was better than this agony, anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die, and now again, hark, louder, 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 louder. Villains! I shrieked. Dissemble no more, I admit the deed. Tear up the planks, here, here. It is the beating of his hideous heart. Well, there you go, very dramatic end there. Okay, so what I want you to do now is I want you to pause the video, have a go answering these questions. Please flick back. I'm going to attach the copy of the story on Show My Homework as well. Pause the video now and answer those 5 questions just to check your understanding of part 3, the final part of the story. Good luck. Okay, so what was getting louder and agitated than the narrator? Turns out by the end, of course, we know it to be the old man's heartbeat that he thinks he hears. But at that moment, of course, at the start of part 3, it is what he perceives still to be the old man's heartbeat. What does the narrator do to the old man? He kills him in a rather gruesome way. Where did he dispose of the body? Under the floorboards, some planks of wood on the floor. What is the sound that the narrator thinks he hears when talking to the policemen? The continuous sound of the old man's heartbeat, despite him being dead. What is surprising about the ending? I find it quite surprising how the narrator gives himself up. And what we infer from that is probably due to his feelings of guilt. Okay, so exploring language. What we're going to focus on today is a little bit about how the writer implies the narrator's feelings of remorse. Okay, because after the murder, the narrator expresses feelings of calm and having a light heart right after it itself. However, things begin to change quite rapidly. This paragraph is about midway through part 3. Okay, what I'd like you to do is just find and choose one word. What is one word in that paragraph there that you think, and where the indicator indicates, the writer indicates a change on the narrator and the narrator's mood? Okay, so you may have identified it, but it's that word but, that conjunction to imply contrast or change itself. Okay, so that's a big shift away from this idea of answering cheerily the policemen's questions. Okay, and then what I'd like you to do, after the word but, all the way to the end of that paragraph, can you identify any other words or phrases that signal and indicate that change in emotion that's implied through the conjunction but? Okay, write them down in your notes. Okay, so you may have identified any of the things I've identified there. Getting pale, head ached, fancied a ring in my ears. It continued and gained definiteness. That's referring to the kind of sound that he's hearing in his ears itself. Okay, all of those imply a change from that joy that's implied earlier on in the narrator himself. Okay, so what I'd like you to do there, okay, is have a look at these statements. What does the writer suggest about the narrator's change? A, B, or C? Which of those do you think is the most correct statement? A, the narrator's change suggests fear of getting caught. B, the narrator's change suggests he is bored of the policemen droning on. Or C, the narrator's change suggests he is feeling guilt over the murder. Pause the video now and just write down the letters A, B, or C. Okay, whilst A is plausible, C is the most likely. That is to do with the sense of getting pale, a sense of feeling guilt over the murder that he's committed itself. Okay, we particularly infer that as the rest of the story continues. Okay, let's delve a little bit deeper into that notion of guilt and remorse. So, across the rest of the text, the use of the noise of the heartbeat, the sound imagery there, can be seen as a metaphor for the narrator's feelings of guilt and remorse. In the following paragraph, which again is the second to last paragraph in the whole story, can you identify and write down any sound imagery of the descriptions of the noise that is vexing and i.e. upsetting the narrator? Okay, pause the video now and write them down. Okay, so things you could have identified. Yet the sound increased. It was a low, dull, quick sound. The repetition of this phrase that happened several times, but the noise steadily increased. But the noise arose overall and continued to increase. It grew louder, 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 and now again, hark, louder, louder, louder. So, probably not quite obvious from the use of repetition there, but what do you notice about the volume? And you'd be right in saying that actually the volume increases, which implies an increased anxiety, but also an increase in the sense of remorse that he's feeling for the deed that he's committed. Because remember, the old man's dead, so his heart actually isn't beating. So that noise is in his head. It's a manifestation of his guilt. Okay? So, and of course we have the grand reveal in the final paragraph. It is the beating of his hideous heart. He literally gives himself away because he can't cope with the level of remorse he feels for the deed he has committed. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now is the final bit on the reflection on this story itself. I would like you to answer that question. How does the writer imply the narrator's feelings of remorse? And remember, we've got lots of notes through this that can help you with that. So I've fronted it for you. Towards the end of the story, the writer uses sound imagery in order to finish that sentence. This is clear when he writes. In there you need some textual detail from the text and summarize what that textual detail shows. And then think about why the writer has used that sound imagery in that way. Okay, don't forget to submit that or email it to your class teachers. Very well done, and I hope you enjoyed Tell-Tale Heart. I think it's a cracking little story, and I hope you have a lovely half term.